Today we turn to the important work of Bertrand Russell in the history of analytic philosophy, especially its first part. Here's a picture of Russell as a relatively young man. I'm not sure exactly when the photo was taken, but it looks to me like he's maybe 30 or so. Here's Russell later in life. I believe this picture was taken in the 60s, but maybe not quite that old for him. But in any case, the difference between old men and young men is a bit astonishing. I mean, I guess we all look slightly different as we age, but I'm not sure if I saw this person and then didn't see them in the intervening years, I'd be able to figure out that they were the same person, unless there's something beyond what they look like that would help me. In any case, we have now completed our background work in Frege for understanding the work of Russell. So we're going to focus on more Russell and Wittgenstein in the first part of the course. We've already done more, and we'll now turn to Russell. The important thing to note, by the way, about the work of Frege, apart from its influence on Russell, is the way in which it launched a new subdiscipline in philosophy. Various subdisciplines in philosophy have a long history. For example, metaphysics and epistemology and ethics go all the way back to the Greeks, to the origins of Western philosophy. As philosophy became more specialized, various other subdisciplines come into play. Philosophy of mind, for example, comes into a place of its own. Philosophy of religion does, philosophy of language does, philosophy of logic does. These are primarily 20th century subdisciplines. It's not that work in these areas didn't occur earlier, but there wasn't identifiable specializations of any sort in these areas. The big ones for our purposes, connected to the history of analytic philosophy, are the philosophies of language and mind. And both of these trace to Frege, but philosophy of language especially. Philosophy of language culminates in the breakoff of semantics as a special science in the 1950s and 60s especially, after the work of Chomsky. But the formal aspect of philosophy of language can be traced easily to the Fregean project of trying to develop a new logic and give a formal semantics connected with it. So we owe Frege a lot, not just for his influence on Russell, but also for the developments that occurred in philosophy of language and semantics in particular. So let's back up a little bit to give some background for where we're headed when we talk about Russell's contributions here. This is some philosophy of language background, which traces to the work of Frege in particular. So suppose you begin thinking about language by noting how it is learned, where the primary first steps are pointing and using the relevant word to refer to an object. Think of how, I don't know whether you learned a second language anytime in your life, but most of us have. And one of the first things you do is you're introduced to vocabulary. So you're shown pictures or objects, and then the names associated with them are told to you. So you do this with kids too when you're trying to teach them a language. You point to objects and you identify the kind of object in question, pointing and using the relevant word that refers to the object. Such thinking makes referentialism an easy position to take about meaning. Words mean what people use them to refer to. That's a natural starting point for understanding language. Now, it turns out it's complicated because we do use words to refer to things primarily when we're using names. So when you have a name for an individual, it's obvious that what you're doing is using that name to pick out or refer to the person whose name it is. It's a little less obvious that reference plays a role when you're talking about kind terms. For example, when you're teaching children a language, you point out objects and you say what kind of thing they are. You say dog, you say cat, horse, flower, tree, maybe even special kinds of trees, oak tree, maple tree, aspen tree, house, car, maybe particular kinds of cars. That's a Ford truck, that's a Chevy truck. You do all those sorts of things, and those are not names. They are rather kind terms because they don't single out a particular individual entity, but rather a group of entities. In any case, it looks like something similar is going on between names and kind terms, at least when the kind terms are ones that you can empirically, experientially identify. You point at the object and you use the term. The idea of pointing and connecting the term to the thing or kind of thing makes it look like you're doing something like referring to the things, and so it looks like referentialism is a pretty nice place to start in our understanding of language. Such a position, if you go full-blown referentialism, lands one in a sea of trouble immediately. Lots of words denote objects, we might grant, but lots don't, and it's easy to focus myopically on words by looking at the context of learning or the context of the origins of language. But many words have no meaning in themselves, but they do once you put them in the context of a whole sentence. Consider, for example, the words of and for. So maybe a theory of meaning should focus on sentences and not just on words. Once we focus on sentences, however, referentialism has to be abandoned. For basic sentence structure involves subjects and predicates, and at most we should look for a role for reference or denotation with respect to subject terms, not predicate terms. We can think of Frege and his new logic as beginning from precisely this point. Whatever reference or denotation has to do with meaning, it has to do with it only with respect to subject terms, not predicate terms. Once the role of reference is limited in this way, one can view Frege's philosophy of language as saying something like the following. The major difficulties in understanding language arise with the notion of denotation or reference. Meaning might have something to do with reference when it comes to the subjects of sentences, but not when it comes to predicates. So let's see if referentialism can work at the place it seems most at home. Nope, not going to work, because meaning is intimately connected with cognitive significance, and that connection can't be accounted for using the notion of reference alone, because the problem of identity statements, the problem of opaque contexts, where substitution of co-referential expressions doesn't preserve cognitive significance. Now notice where this points us in the philosophy of language. What is problematic and what isn't from this perspective. We don't worry about accounting for meaning when it comes to predicative expressions, but we do worry immensely when we try to account for the meaning of subject terms. We worry because we find referentialism attractive and notice that it can't do the explanatory work required. So we have to adjust. If we're Fregean, we adjust metaphysically by talking about a third realm, which is neither purely mental nor purely non-mental, as is the external world of ordinary objects. But notice the predilection here. The meaning of a predicative expression is handled in passing. We divide language into subjects and predicates and associate each with a metaphysical distinction between objects and concepts. Frege devotes hardly any attention, though, to the question of what a concept is, except to note that it isn't an object. And so we don't have to be Platonists in particular, thinking that universals exist. At the very least, this leaves us with an incomplete philosophy of language. We have a connection between predicates and concepts, and another relation between subjects and objects. We might say that predicates express concepts and that subjects denote, designate, or refer to objects. But then we immediately turn our focus to the question of whether the latter relation is sufficient for giving a complete account of the meaning of subject phrases. Frege then says yes for some, but no for others, since some subject phrases are actually predicative expressions, as in generalizations. all whales are mammals has no denoting expressions in it, in spite of obviously having a subject phrase. So notice where the problematics are found. The more we explain various features of language in terms of predicative expressions, the less there is to worry about. Let me repeat that, because this is really important for understanding what's going on when we come to Russell. When you're talking about predicative expressions and the role that they play in language, Frege doesn't actually worry about that. He says you've got a predicate. Well, we have this nice expression relation that holds between predicates and concepts. Your question should be, tell me more. I don't understand this expression relation. I know what the ordinary use of the word expression is in English. People express their ideas. If you don't know how language works, you might think that certain coffee machines kick out something called espresso. That's a joke, by the way. It's not espresso, and so it has nothing to do with the word expression. In any case, people have expressions. There are expressions in language. People express their ideas, their thoughts, their nonsense, whatever. Things that come out of your mouth are your expressions. Some of us have unusual expressions, ones that other people don't engage in. I understand that kind of talk about expressions, you should say, but I don't understand this relation of expression that you're citing between predicates and concepts. I need more of a theory about this. And Frege just doesn't give us one. What he does is he turns to subject terms that actually play a referential role and then asks whether the meaning of these terms can be understood solely in terms of reference, to which the answer he gives is no. In any case, what we worry about is the land where reference plays a role. So some subject phrases are actually predicative expressions in disguise, while others are not. So what we explore is whether referentialism is an adequate theory of meaning for denoting phrases, assuming that the expression relation between predicates and concepts is not something that we need to worry about very much. The important thing here is the pattern of development of a semantic theory. We see a pattern. When we develop a theory of meaning, the trouble spots are those where we expect or hope that reference can tell us the whole story. We are not, at this point in history, especially concerned about the part of language that is predicative. Hence, the assumption being made is that the more we can shove into predicative position, the less work we have to do in constructing a theory of meaning. That's the crucial pattern to note here. So you've got sentences, some of which are about particulars, and some of which are general. General sentences are all of the ones that are involved in Aristotelian categorical logic. Sentences like all S or P, some S or P, no S or P, some S or not P. Those are general judgments. They do have subjects and predicates, but the subjects are not playing a referential role. It's only when we come to sentences that we would classify as particular judgments that we need to worry about the role of reference. So sentences that have particular judgments are going to be things that use names, things that use indexicals, demonstratives, sentences that denote, so denoting phrases more generally. So with this assumption as background, Bertrand Russell writes on denoting in 1905. On Denoting is almost certainly the most famous paper of the 20th century in analytic philosophy. I can't think of any individual paper that has been discussed and had the enormous influence that this paper had. It's a beautiful piece of writing, both structurally and in terms of its content, and I'll go through both of those things with more attention to the structural issues than is usually given in attention to on denoting. But the significance of on denoting is enough that there's actually a 100-year anniversary issue of Mind, the journal in which it originally appeared and which is the most illustrious, long-standing journal in philosophy. Mind is typically ranked as one of the 5 top journals even now, but for a long time it was the premier publishing outlet in analytic philosophy. And it's certainly the longest standing of the top 5 journals. If you're interested, the top 5 journals, some people say some things and some say others, but it certainly includes Phil Review, the Philosophical Review published out of Cornell, the Journal of Philosophy published out of Columbia, Mind published by the Oxford Association. And then after those top 3, you get some disparities. Probably Philosophy and Phenomenological Research is one of the top 5. And then the 5th one, it's kind of up for grabs. There are surveys done on these things. If you're interested, look at the Leiter reports and you can see what philosophers across primarily America, but the English-speaking world, how they have ranked the top journals in philosophy. So in any case, I think the top 4 are pretty secure, and then who comes in at number 5 and after that varies a bit. It's not quite as clear-cut. In any case, Mind is incredibly important, and there's no paper more important than Russell's on denoting. So here's a word of warning about the language. This paper is awkwardly written at many points, and here's why. Russell is using the resources of his understanding of first-order logic and will translate problematic expressions into that language. That's what he's doing. Remember the role of logical form. It is absolutely central to linking our understanding of language with our metaphysical understanding of reality. It's through this notion of logical form that we can make progress in metaphysics and avoid common mistakes, common inelegancies, common goofiness of metaphysical speculation that isn't warranted or required by a proper understanding of language. So that's what he's doing. Russell is a master of first-order logic, but he understands that his audience at the time will not be familiar at all with the apparatus in question. So he resorts to somewhat stilted ordinary language expressions instead of formal symbols. The trick to seeing what he's doing is to connect the stilted language with the relevant expressions in the formal language. So where we would use things like for all x, and then say something like that to express a universal generalization, he says something about what's true at all times or something like that, as if this were a temporal judgment rather than a universal quantifier. He's doing that because he thinks that will more effectively communicate what the symbols would represent. I'm not sure he's right about that, but in any case, that's what he's doing. So let's take a look at on denoting. On denoting starts out by getting to the point. Structurally, this is beautiful. There's nothing worse than reading papers that are going to talk about a certain thing and defend a certain point of view, but they give you the impression that the author can't figure out how to start at all, doesn't know where to start. So you get what Al Martinich has called a running start. So you're going to claim that knowledge is not justified true belief. Suppose that's your thesis. Well, this thesis falls into the topic of the nature of knowledge, and the nature of knowledge is a central part of the subdiscipline of epistemology. So instead of just launching into your thesis and talking about how you're going to defend it, you feel like you need to ease into it. So you say things like, epistemology has been a central subdiscipline in philosophy since the very beginning of Western philosophy. And in fact, even in Eastern philosophy, there's all sorts of discussion of epistemological matters. Okay, now this is a running start because you're just afraid to get to the point. I don't know why you're doing it. I don't know why you're wasting the reader's time, but you are. Russell does not waste the reader's time. He says, by a denoting phrase, I mean a phrase such as any of the following. A man, some man, any man, every man, all men, the present king of England, the center of mass of the solar system at the first instant of the 20th century, the revolution of the earth around the sun, the revolution of the sun around the earth. Thus, a phrase is denoting only in virtue of its form. That's how the essay starts. Note that Russell's category here includes items that Frege has already pushed into the domain of the predicative, namely when the phrases are indefinite descriptions. So a man or some man or any man or every man or all men, all of those will count as indefinite descriptions, and they are to be treated as you treat predicates in general. They express concepts, and there is no reference role for anything to be playing in our understanding of such sentences. So some things on the list we don't need to worry about when we're thinking about how denotation or reference works. Notice, however, what isn't on this list. This list doesn't include names or deictic elements like indexicals and demonstratives. Those are not discussed here by Russell at all. And I think perhaps the reason for that is Russell never was happy with what to say. He kept vacillating throughout the course of his early years working on the metaphysics and epistemology of logic and mathematics. He was never happy with what to say about names. We'll see that later when we turn to the matter of knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. But for here, let's just flag it and move on. It is a striking omission, but probably not a cause for concern. You're going to have to figure out what to say about names later on. For it looks as if the last sentence in the quote gives us a reason to include them because each phrase he mentions is one that can appear in the subject position of a sentence. So if we focus on the form of such expressions, it would seem that names can be thought of as having the same form as the items that Russell actually mentions. Russell then presents his first-order logic in ordinary prose and shows how to represent items on his list. What remains are phrases containing the word the, which he says are by far the most interesting and difficult of denoting phrases. So we're going to primarily focus on definite descriptions in this paper. Russell notes as well, quite properly, that some words have no semantic value in themselves, but only in context. Think of such, for example. So some linguistic items can be semantically characterized without assigning them a semantic value, but rather by characterizing semantically every sentence in which they appear. The consequences of this remark are these. We don't need a semantic value for denoting expressions. We don't need a semantic value for quantifiers. What is needed is first an account of the underlying logical form of a sentence, and then the logic does the rest, especially the semantics. Note the move here from the unit of meaning being a word to the unit of meaning being an entire sentence. This is going to come back for further discussion when we get to Quine in the 1950s. Quine is going to worry that we went from the central unit being that of a word to that of a sentence, and what we really need to do is move to entire theories. where sentences and words get the meaning they have in virtue of the context, the theoretical context in which they're embedded. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but in any case, Russell wants us to focus on sentences. So first, he tells us what the theory is. The theory says, if you've got a definite description, it says three things. First, something is phi. Second, it's also psi. So if you put those two together, you get an existentially quantified sentence that says there is a thing that is both phi and psi. So suppose the sentence is, the author of this book is an African American. Well, then you've got phi being author of this book, person who authored this book, and psi is African American. And you say, there is something that is the author of this book and is an African American. That's very obvious. So that's conditions 1 and 2. What is left out of that formulation is the uniqueness claim. The definite description requires something more than just that there is an author of this book who is African American. There's something unique about the individual in question. That's what the third clause is going to do for us. The third clause, Russell says, is that nothing else is such an author of this book. And the way you write that in ordinary first-order logic is this. For all y, if y is an author of this book, then y is identical with x, the individual picked out. So when you put the two clauses together, this clause and this clause, you make sure that the existential quantifier with which you began binds the entire formula so that the x in question in the second clause is the same x that we found in this initial conjunction. Okay, so a three-part identification of the logical form of definite description sentences. So Russell's theory, he gives us an example. Here's his sentence. The father of Charles II was executed. And here's Russell's account. Notice he doesn't use symbols because he doesn't think his audience will be familiar with them. And he resorts to temporal language to try to explain what the quantifier is that's being used. So it's not always false that looks like not always false that not always gets represented that way. So it looks like we're getting, this looks like an existential quantifier of some sort because by the dual rule, not all gives us some not. So what are we supposed to say here? The problem is there's more than one negation. Not and false. So I wrote down, we had it's not always, that's his language for the denial of a universal quantifier, and then false. Now, if you remember your dual rules from logic, or if you didn't take logic yet, I talked about these earlier. That's just an existential quantifier. So we don't need a negation after it because there is, in Russell's language, two negations involved, one before the quantifier and one afterward. So in contemporary terminology, he's expressing an existential quantifier in very stilted ordinary language. It's not always false of x that. So what we get is there is an x. There is an x such that, and then he says, x begat Charles II, and X was executed, and if Y begat Charles II, Y is identical with X, is always true of Y. Now, always true of Y is, of course, just the universal quantifier. Put in this temporal language that I find a bit misleading, but given that the people he's talking to don't know anything about formal logic yet, it's probably perfectly fine, and maybe it's the best you can do. In any case, notice that's just what we have. Listed up here, there are 3 clauses, so you get, there is an X such that X begat C. We're letting C be our constant that refers to Charles II. X was executed, and for all Y, if Y begat Charles II, then Y is identical with X. So here's Russell's paraphrase, or what we might do as a paraphrase into less cumbersome natural language. There is an X such that X begat C, X was executed, and for any Y, Y begat C only if Y is identical with X. The meaning is fairly clear. Exactly one person begat Charles II, and that person was executed. So that's Russell's example of how the theory works. He then says this, the above gives a reduction of all propositions in which denoting phrases occur to forms in which no such phrases occur. Why it is imperative to effect such a reduction, the subsequent discussion will endeavor to show. So the first thing is, what point is he making here? We're giving a reduction of all propositions that have definite descriptions in them to ones which don't. No definite description occurs here, or here, or here. So we started with a definite description, which seemed like it was going to force us to talk about some role of reference in our theory of meaning with respect to this sentence. But once we're done, it turns out no role for reference needs to be invoked at all for understanding this sentence, because notice all we have are predicates and quantifiers. We do have this one name, Charles II. So you might wonder, what are we going to do with that? But again, that's not anything about this particular sentence being used and its logical form, which involves a definite description. Instead, he's going to have to tell us something about names later on. But besides all of that, if we bracket the worry about the name Charles II, everything else is just quantifiers and variables and predicates, and of course, logical elements as well. So the role of reference is eliminated entirely by this analysis, unless the definite description that we're talking about is one where there's a name in it, and we have to say something about names on independent grounds. So we get a reduction. And notice what that does is something that Frege already had us doing for general propositions already. Frege had us treat all whales are mammals as a sentence that has no referring expressions in it at all. There's just predicates, and we don't need to worry about predicates. So that's the point about the predilection for worries about reference, and not so much worries about this expression relation between predicates and constants. Russell is doing the same thing. He's taking an entire class of sentences in English that look like they need to be addressed in terms of some notion of reference, and he's showing us, no, they don't. They don't need to be addressed in any way different than the kinds of general propositions that Frege already helped us see we don't need to worry about. Okay, so that's the theory, and Russell is very clear. This is the theory. I haven't defended it. I'm just stating it. I'll defend it later. We're going to look at the defense later, but after stating the theory, he says, let's talk a little bit about what other approaches are like to these kinds of sentences. Now, structurally, this is a bit of a detour. Why are you doing this? Maybe one way to think about it is, I want you to understand that this is historically important, at least. Other people have talked about this. The reason they talked about it is because we need an understanding of it. And what they ended up saying about it is stuff that we shouldn't be happy with at all. So there's a problem here to be addressed. Sometimes this occurs earlier in an article, where you try to get the reader to buy into the significance of what you're thinking and writing about. But in any case, that's what Russell is doing. Notice, however, that in doing this, he focuses on historical individuals, not on the logical space of the problem. The logical space would say, here's one approach. What are the alternatives to it? The problem is, who knows what the range of alternatives to Russell's theory of definite descriptions are? I mean, you can do the obvious thing and say, well, there's two kinds of theories. There's Russell's theory and there's all the rest. But that's not insightful. That doesn't give you an idea of a competing theory. So he's looking for an actual example of an alternative to his theory, and he finds actual examples in the work of Meinong, in the work of Frege. So he's going to look at two alternatives. The Frege one is obvious that we're going to need to talk about. But remember, Russell is more metaphysically motivated in general than is Frege. Frege is interested in the foundations of mathematics, and so indirectly in metaphysical questions. But Russell is interested in logic as a way of linking language, reality, and the epistemic standing of certain of our mental items, beliefs in particular. Which ones of those have illustrious standing, called those things we know to be true, and which don't. So he's interested in this big philosophical project of linking mind, language, and world up. Frege is interested primarily in a subpart of that. So we're going to get to Frege in a minute, but let's start with Meinong. Of the possible theories which admit such constituents, the simplest is that of Meinong. This theory regards any grammatically correct denoting phrase as standing for an object. You should here the notion of reference. So the Meinongian theory says, nope, we're going to have to advert to the notion of reference to understand how these sentences work. Thus, the present King of France, the round square, are supposed to denote genuine objects. And then Meinong grants that such objects do not subsist, but nevertheless they are supposed to be objects. So Meinong reverses what would have been, to my mind, the most natural way to characterize this. I would have said such objects don't exist, but they subsist, let's say. Because why don't they exist? Because there isn't any present King of France, and there couldn't be a round square. Meinong reverses it. So for him, reality that we investigate through the sciences is the domain of things that subsist. And these other things are nonetheless objects, and so they exist, they just don't subsist. Strikes me as backwards, but the point is the same. It doesn't matter what the terms are. So, what's wrong with Meinong's view? Why don't we take these things to refer for there to be objects of the sort? First point, Russell says, this is embarrassing. It violates the law of non-contradiction. The round square is both round and not round. That argument needs to be laid out very carefully, because the round square you start with, the round square has two properties. It is round and it is square. And then somehow you got to get from the squareness of the object to it not being round. That needs to be articulated carefully, but looks like it ought to be able to be done, but you need to say how that is supposed to go. In virtue of what is a square an object that is not round? Well, you're going to have to appeal to some analysis of the notion of squareness so that it's a matter of logical inference that if it's square, then it's not round. That may be more difficult than Russell imagines, because he doesn't actually lay out the argument, but it has to be laid out. Compare this problem, which is going to plague Wittgenstein's work in the Tractatus. Consider the sentence, "Nothing is both red and green all over." That sentence can't be true, but is it a logical truth that nothing can be red and green all over? For it to be a logical truth, you'd have to have an analysis of one of the two terms, red or green, so that it involved or included the denial of the other. But that's not how we understand color predicates. And maybe it's not how we understand geometric shapes either. If you're talking about a round square and you look at the geometric descriptions of them, the meaning of square can be given without any reference to round or not round, and the meaning of round can be given without any reference to square or not square. So maybe a round square is not in violation of the principle of non-contradiction after all, because for that to be true, there has to be a logical incompatibility, not just a necessary incompatibility. Okay, that's subtle. We'll come back to that worry about the difference between logical and metaphysical necessity later on in the semester, especially when we get to the work of Kripke in the late 60s. But it's something to flag. It also, by the way, was raised in the 1920s by Frank Ramsey, one of the great losses to the history of philosophy in the 20th century, who died before he was 30. I believe it was 26 or 27, but I'm not sure. We'll look that up when we get to the time frame. Ramsey was the director of Wittgenstein's dissertation, his dissertation that used the Tractatus as his dissertation. And he wrote a review of the Tractatus where he pointed out the red and green problem, because Wittgenstein requires that all necessary truths are logically necessary. That means there needs to be a definition of red or green in terms of the denial of the other. And Ramsey's point was that's not the way these things work. There are spheres of exhaustive and exclusive categories, but where none of those members of those exclusive and exhaustive category schemes are defined in terms of the negation of the others. Here's another description. Here's another objection to Meinong. This is from a paper much later on, 1919, so 14 years later. And by this point, Russell has become more articulate about what he doesn't like about Meinong's view. So here we go. It is argued, e.g. by Meinong, that we can speak about the golden mountain, the round square, and so on. We can make true propositions of which these are the subjects. Hence, they must have some kind of logical being, since otherwise the propositions in which they occur would be meaningless. In such theories, it seems to me, there is a failure of that feeling for reality, which ought to be preserved even in the most abstract studies. A failure of that feeling for reality, which ought to be preserved. Logic, I should maintain, must no more admit a unicorn than zoology can. For logic is concerned with the real world just as truly as zoology, though with its more abstract and general features. Right, I want to stop and make a remark about that. Russell here is endorsing a view that logic is about the world in some sense at the most abstract and general level. Contemporary philosophers and philosophers of logic would generally not say such a thing. They would say logic is not about the world. It's not about the real world except indirectly. What it is about is the totality of logical space. So logic is about what's logically necessary and what links between premises and conclusions guarantee the truth of the conclusion given the truth of the premises. Now, you might generalize that and say something about, oh no, sometimes there's a sports relation between premises and conclusions that doesn't guarantee truth. But in any case, logic is about the totality of logical space. As soon as you say that, though, you're adverting to some notion of necessity that applies to the entirety of this space. So a necessary truth will be one that's true at every point in the logical space in question. Russell, however, along with other people at this point in history, was suspicious of the notions of necessity and possibility, didn't like to talk about logic or language or anything else in terms of these categories. Part of the reason here is the demand for precision in science, math, philosophy, and any attempt to understand what the world is like required that the use of the terms that we rely on has to be precise and characterizable in precise terms. So at this point in history, there are some dubious candidates for theoretical purposes that people were worried about. Most importantly, possibility and necessity, that's one kind of worry. Russell is skeptical about these notions, in part because the logic of modality hadn't been developed yet. So he's suspicious because there's no precise theory that he can point to, whereas there is a first-order logic that he and others have been developing. Another notion is the notion of truth, because truth seems subject to paradoxes. That's disturbing because if we can't talk about truth and falsity, it's going to be a little bit hard to characterize what we're doing in science, for example, when we try to figure out what the world is like. And a third notion was the notion of confirmation itself. We'll talk more about worries about the notion of confirmation when we get to the post-World War I second part of the history of analytic philosophy. But given these concerns, you need to be able to characterize logic in some way, Russell thought, so that you didn't use language which committed you to some domain of logical space and some connected notion of necessity and possibility. So he says, logic is concerned with the real world just as much as zoology is, though with its more abstract and general features. To say that unicorns have an existence in heraldry or in literature or in imagination is a most pitiful and paltry evasion. What exists in heraldry is not an animal made of flesh and blood, moving and breathing of its own initiative. What exists is a picture or a description in words. Similarly, to maintain that Hamlet, for example, exists in his own world, namely in the world of Shakespeare's imagination, just as truly as, say, Napoleon existed in the ordinary world, is to say something deliberately confusing, or else confused to a degree which is scarcely credible. There's only one world, the real world. Shakespeare's imagination is part of it, and the thoughts that he had in writing Hamlet are real. So are the thoughts we have in reading the play. But it is of the very essence of fiction that only the thoughts, feelings, etc. in Shakespeare and his readers are real, and that there is not, in addition to them, an objective Hamlet. When you have taken account of all the feelings roused by Napoleon in writers and readers of history, you have not touched the actual man. But in the case of Hamlet, you have come to the end of him. If no one thought about Hamlet, there would be nothing left of him. If no one had thought about Napoleon, he would have soon seen to it that someone did. Okay, that's probably accurate about Napoleon. He was assertive, let's say. In any case, the point here that Russell is emphasizing is Meinong lacks a healthy sense of reality. And this is a charge that should always be kept in the back of our minds when we're reading about the devices that philosophers say we must include to give a full account of truth, falsity, the metaphysical reality of all there is, and that sort of thing. Are you showing a healthy sense of reality or not? And Russell's fundamental worry about Meinong is he doesn't have one of these things. He's gone off the deep end. He thinks there is an object that is the round square, that is the golden mountain, that is the fountain of youth, that Ponce de Leon was apparently seeking, the city of gold that the Spanish were coming up to try to find in Colorado, that sort of thing. A healthy sense of reality says, sorry guys, you're just confused. There isn't any such thing. There isn't any such thing, full stop. Not that there is such a thing in some sense or other. There just isn't any such thing. And here, what I like about Russell's language is he belabors the point, and maybe sometimes points should be belabored. So don't be doing this hand-waving crap about existence in heraldry or in literature or in imagination or in fiction. Fictional truth is just not true. It's a most pitiful and paltry evasion. That's what the healthy sense of reality leads you to say. So that, I think, is his fundamental objection. The earlier one about violating the law of non-contradiction looks like there's something there, but it has to be made out carefully. I'm not sure it can be, but at least a round square is an impossible object. And one thing we know for sure is that there aren't any things that are impossible objects. So I say. In any case, he then turns from Meinong to Frege. What should we say about Frege? Frege faces the problem of empty names and offers two options here. One option that I attributed to Frege when we talked about it was the truth value gap one, and the one that abandons the law of bivalence. That's not the only option that Frege considers, though. The other one is the chosen object route. And here, Frege suggests, we can, if we want to preserve bivalence, we can let the empty set be the chosen object to which empty names refer. Okay, so you have the chosen object route, and the other one involves truth value gaps. So that sentences with empty names will have a sense, but no truth value. Russell doesn't address the truth value gaps option, but he does object to the chosen object option. Here's what he says. This procedure, though it may not lead to any actual error, is plainly artificial and doesn't give an exact analysis of the matter. Now, this is not the most elaborated objection. Compare it to the elaborated lack of a healthy sense of reality that we found when he, in his maturer stage, addressed what he didn't like about Meinong's view. This is cryptic, but it's on to something important. It is plainly artificial. Clark Kent is an empty name. What does it refer to? On the chosen object route, it refers to the empty set. That's weird. What do you mean it refers to the empty set? Are there any other empty names in the language? Yes, there are. So pick them. Pick another empty name like Captain America. Then it turns out Captain America is African American and Clark Kent is African American, express precisely the same thought. Unless you can come up with something having to do with the sense of the two terms that is different in the two cases. Now, Frege doesn't tell us much about how he's going to handle senses for proper names. Maybe there's something he can resort to here, and maybe he'll say the same thing as he said in general, that, this is just another reason why we need to posit senses in addition to reference. But notice the truth value for the sentences is run off of the reference of the sentences. The reference is gotten to through the senses in question, but the senses don't affect the truth value. So it turns out every sentence attributing any property to Clark Kent will have to have the same truth value as a sentence attributed to Captain America. So if you want any notion of truth for such sentences, think of Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street. If you want anything like that to come out true, or if you want to explain the difference between Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street and Sherlock Holmes doesn't live on Baker Street, you're going to need some notion of reference to play a role. In any case, what Frege is doing here is plainly artificial and certainly can't be an exact analysis of this particular aspect of language. We ought to give an account of names on which we say the same thing semantically about the semantic significance of names, whether they're empty or not. That's the Russell objection. About the other option, the truth value gap option, Russell is silent here. Russell is one of the most firmly convinced bivalence theorists in the history of philosophy. Perhaps he doesn't say much about truth value gaps because he finds it an absurd idea that sentences can lack truth values but nonetheless be meaningful sentences. That view strikes me as the more natural option for Frege to pursue rather than the chosen object, arbitrary, stipulative account that is his other option that allows him to preserve bivalence. In any case, that's the two historical individuals that Russell here talks about as offering an alternative to his view. So notice the general facts about it. The first general fact is Meinong takes definite descriptions too seriously. He treats them as legitimate referential expressions. Russell's theory says we don't need to do that. We can push whatever of cognitive significance there is in such sentences into predicative position. And so there won't be any more role for reference in these sentences than there is for general propositions such as all whales are mammals in the first place. That's his response to Meinong. His response to Frege is slightly different, and it's the first time in this paper that the notion of a name comes into play. So Frege has a theory, and his theory treats referring expressions the same, whether they're definite descriptions or names. Both of them get treated as referential expressions. And notice, Russell doesn't attack Frege's notion of a definite description. So when Frege says the morning star, that phrase has a referent, it's Venus, and the evening star has a referent, Venus. Russell is disagreeing with Frege, but he doesn't point that out or acknowledge it. I guess what he could say is, Frege, you didn't have to do that. You didn't need to invent senses for phrases like that. Your theory already had the resources to deal with those by pushing everything into the predicative position. There's still the problem of names, and Russell hasn't solved or addressed the problem of names here. But he goes after Frege about names, and he says, there are two costs. One is, on the chosen object route, your view is arbitrary and clearly doesn't get to the heart of the matter. It doesn't tell us what the meaning of Sherlock Holmes, Clark Kent, Captain America is. We don't get insight into the meaning of these terms on your theory. Either that or you're going to give up bivalence, and shame on you. Nobody should give up bivalence. Enough of trying to convince us, though, that this is at least a historically important topic. So what we've got so far is Russell tells us what a denoting phrase is. He says the most difficult ones to explain and account for are the definite descriptions. Here's my theory of them. It's a three-part theory. And this is important because there are some people in history with alternative proposals or views. Now it's time to argue for my theory, he says. Now there's a couple of things going on when he argues for his theory. He says the virtue of my theory is that there are some puzzles that we need to explain, and my theory can explain them. The puzzles are substitutivity and opaque context. So King George wondered whether Scott is the author of Waverley, but not whether Scott is Scott. Scott is, in fact, the author of Waverley. Excluded middle, either the present King of France is bald or he isn't. It looks like excluded middle commits you to that sentence, and yet there's something awkward about it because there isn't a present King of France. And finally, the problem of negative existentials. Santa Claus doesn't exist. Now, that's a negative existential. What Russell actually talks about is where A and B don't differ, and then he talks about the difference between A and B. So you have a case where A and B are identical. Think of the beginning of Frege's On Sense and Reference. And then Russell wants to talk about the difference between A and B being non-existent. That's the problem of negative existentials. What I want you to notice is that Russell's solutions to these problems hardly ever adverts to his theory of definite descriptions at all. It's a really interesting divergence. I'm trying to think what the right word to call it is. The theory of definite descriptions needs to be argued for, but it's not actually going to do the explanatory work that what has come to be called the scope distinction plays. So I want you to hear this, that we're really talking about a scope distinction. By the way, the scope distinction has to do with, let's take an ambiguous sentence. This is in Shakespeare. All that glitters is not gold. Now, in the context in which that sentence is used, this is really supposed to be a denial of a universal claim. It's not the case that everything that glitters is gold, because it's a warning about not being deceived by appearances. Notice, however, that the word not appears very late in the sentence. And yet, when I tell you what the sentence is expressing, I moved it all the way to the front. I said, it's not the case that everything that glitters is gold. We could have equally said, some things that glitter are not gold. But that's weird too, because the sentence started with all, and now I changed it to some. What that signals is a distinction of scope for this logical particle or operator. It can take wide scope, where you move it way to the front of the sentence as I did, or it can take narrow scope. If it takes narrow scope, the sentence would be read this way. Everything that glitters is a non-gold substance. But that's clearly not what Shakespeare was meaning to say. That's the scope distinction. And it turns out scope distinctions occur quite often in philosophy. We study them in modal logic. For example, when you say X is necessarily Y, bicyclists are necessarily bipedal, humans are necessarily rational. The necessity operator here can take either wide or narrow scope as well. It can sit out in front of the entire sentence. Call that the de dicto reading, dicto meaning statement or sentence. So it's the necessity being attached to an entire sentence or statement. It can also take narrow scope, call that the de re reading, because re is the Latin word for object. So it's necessity residing in the thing itself. You as a human have a certain property essentially. You couldn't, if I say all humans are essentially necessarily rational, and I mean that in the de re sense where the necessity operator has narrow scope, then I'm committed to saying of you that you couldn't exist if you weren't rational. It's an essential property of yours. So scope distinctions are very important, and there are important modal confusions in the history of philosophy that rely on this confusion. Some versions of the freedom for knowledge problem are just like that. As we'll see, Quine's argument against modal logic relies on the confusion, which is interesting because this confusion is understood by medieval philosophers nearly 1,000 years before Quine is writing. It's just that we don't study medieval philosophy as much as we study other parts of philosophy, so it gets lost. In any case, let's look on substitutivity. The substitutivity problem is that King George wonders whether Scott is the author of Waverley, but not whether Scott is Scott. Russell's explanation appeals to the difference between grammatical and logical form. The sentence in English seems to have variable positions in which the name of an object could be inserted. But the logical form of the sentence shows that, in fact, there is only one. That's because, if you go back to the sentence, Russell's theory tells us that the phrase, the author of Waverley, is not a name. We don't need to invoke any notion of reference to understand it. Now, that's fine for the particular example that he picked, but the substitutivity problem in opaque contexts is not always a context where you have one name and one definite description. So, for example, even though Clark Kent and Superman are the same person, Lois Lane is in love with one but not the other. Lois Lane is not in love with Clark Kent, but she is in love with Superman. So note that Russell's solution here is only a partial solution to the problem of opaque contexts. So King George could wonder whether, this is probably anachronistic. No, it's probably not. He could wonder whether Mark Twain is Sam Clemens, but not wonder whether Mark Twain is Mark Twain. And nothing in Russell's explanation gets him out of that issue. He's going to have to address the issue of names at some point, but that's not what this paper is about. So Russell's analysis is actually used for the particular version of the substitutivity problem that he addresses. But the substitutivity problem is wider than that raised by the example he gives, and the reason his theory is relevant here is because he picked a substitutivity problem that involves a definite description. So that's sort of a cheating example in a way to make your theory help with the problem in question, while not admitting that it's not really a problem that your theory is equipped to address in full generality. It can only be applied when the substitutivity problem is generated in a way that involves a definite description, but it doesn't need to be. For the other two problems, the account doesn't do any role at all, but instead, the distinction between wide and narrow scope is used. Now, Russell identifies wide scope as the primary occurrence and narrow scope as the secondary, but the language of primary and secondary is not illuminating. So the distinction has come to be called the distinction between wide and narrow scope instead, because that is illuminating. You take a sentence, for example, when you're going to take a sentence linking S and P, and then you're going to stick a negation in there somehow about whatever link is being talked about, you can stick the link as far back in the sentence as you can, or you can stick it as far in the front as you can. If you put it way in the front governing everything else, that's the wide scope reading. If you stick it as far back in the sentence as you can, that's the narrow scope reading. So I will use the language of narrow and wide scope, and you can interpret what Russell says about primary versus secondary in those ways. Wide scope is the primary occurrence, narrow scope is the secondary occurrence. So consider the claim, and here he applies this distinction in some interesting, lots of philosophical humor relies on misreading sentences. So I thought your yacht was larger than it is. Narrow scope has the size of the yacht inside the scope of the thinking. Wide scope has it outside. Thus, narrow scope says this: here's what I thought. The size of your yacht is strictly larger than the size of your yacht. And you'd have to be an idiot to think that. Wide scope reading has the size of the yacht being outside the scope of your thought. So there is a size X that is the size of your yacht, and I thought the size of your yacht is larger than X. That's a perfectly sane thing to think. And it's obvious when somebody says, I thought your yacht was larger than it is, which of those two readings is the right one. But notice again, we have a distinction between wide and narrow scope. Wide and narrow scope readings are fairly ubiquitous in natural language. Lots of philosophical humor trades on substituting one for the other. This same distinction, as I've said, can be applied to negation, as in, all that glitters is not gold. Russell does it this way. The wide scope reading of the present King of France is not bald is this. There is an X who is the present King of France, and it's not the case that X is bald. On the secondary narrow scope reading we get, it's false that there is an X. It is false that there is an X. Actually, my notes here are backwards, aren't they? This is supposed to be the narrow scope reading of the negation, and this is the wide scope reading. I'll correct that in the notes. So on the wide scope reading, it's false that there is an X who is the present King of France and X is bald. The narrow scope reading is there is an X who is the present King of France and that guy's got a lot of hair. So we get two readings here. Russell notes that perplexity results only if the only reading of the sentence is the wide scope reading. He notes the narrow scope reading, on which no perplexity ensues, since the conjunction is false because of the falsity of the first. Again, this is confusing wide and narrow scope. So this is his preferred reading. There is an X who is the present King of France. That's false. So conjoin it to anything you want and you end up with a falsity. Note that the same ambiguity occurs in negative existentials as well. So the distinction between wide and narrow scope handles the problem in full generality. Thus, the difference between A and B doesn't exist should be understood as it's false that there is an X that is the difference between A and B, and X exists. And not as there is an X such that X is the difference between A and B and X does not exist. So the important thing to notice in what's going on here is this solution to non-referring expressions doesn't actually appeal to Russell's account of definite descriptions. So it's a little misleading for Russell to claim that it's a virtue of his theory that it explains away these last two problems. What may be true, though, is this. Russell's theory of definite descriptions makes it easier to see how the scope distinction works, and thus easier to appreciate how scope can be used to disarm these last two objections. Finally, the problem of excluded middle disappears as well, since the claim that the present King of France is bald, or since the claim that the present King of France is not bald is ambiguous between wide and narrow scope, disjoining it to the present King of France is bald will yield an instance of the law of excluded middle only on the wide scope reading, but not on the narrow scope reading. On the wide scope reading, as we saw above, there's no difficulty in seeing why it can be both false that the present King of France is bald and that the present King of France is not bald. Both of them are false, but disjoining those two sentences is not an instance of excluded middle. Okay, so those are the three phenomena that Russell wants to use to form an argument for his theory. And then he turns to this mysterious Gray's elegy example. And you're wondering, why does he do that? Why does he do that at all? And notice By the time we're talking about the Gray's Elegy passage, the only thing left to do is insert a final note, which takes us to the next paper we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll back up to the Gray's Elegy passage. One interesting result of the above theory, imagine him just jumping straight to this conclusion without talking about Gray's Elegy at all. Nothing would be lost in the paper if he had skipped the Gray's Elegy passage entirely. You could have just jumped straight from the 3 puzzles to be solved and the solution to them to this. One interesting result of the above theory of denoting is this: when there is anything with which we do not have immediate acquaintance, but only definition by denoting phrases, then the propositions in which this thing is introduced by means of a denoting phrase do not really contain this thing as a constituent, but contain instead the constituents expressed by the several words of the denoting phrase. So what he's saying here is, think of reference or denotation in Frege, and think of the expression relation that holds between predicates and concepts. The result here is that if you're talking about anything with which we do not have immediate acquaintance, the content of the proposition that we express does not result from any role for a notion of reference, but everything is handled by this expression relation. That's what he's claiming. Thus, in every proposition that we can apprehend, i.e., not only in those whose truth or falsehood we can judge of, but in all that we can think about. So sometimes you can apprehend a proposition but not be able to tell whether it's true or false, but you're nonetheless thinking about that proposition. All of the constituents are really entities with which we have immediate acquaintance. That's the important part. All the constituents are really entities with which we have immediate acquaintance. So if you remember, my complaint about Frege was we get this expression relation between predicates and concepts. I want you to tell me more. Russell here is endeavoring to do precisely that. He says, I have a theory about what goes into thoughts. He calls them propositions, but they're the thing that Frege said referred to as thoughts. What go into thoughts? Everything that's in a thought is something that we can apprehend. All the constituents are really entities with which we have immediate acquaintance. So this is the epistemological criterion Russell uses when it comes to figuring out what goes into thought, what account we give of the elements of thought, what our semantic theory says about thoughts or propositions. Now, such things as matter in the sense in which matter occurs in physics, and the minds of other people are known to us only by denoting phrases, i.e., we are not acquainted with them, but we do know them as what has such and such properties. So we're not acquainted with matter, we're not acquainted with contents of other people's minds, so we are acquainted with them indirectly through descriptions, and then we characterize those descriptions as being connected with certain properties. Hence, although we can form propositional functions, X has a certain property C, or exemplifies a concept C, which must hold of such and such a material particle, or of so-and-so's mind, yet we are not acquainted with the propositions which affirm these things that we know must be true because we can't apprehend the actual entities concerned. He should have said immediately apprehend. What we know is so-and-so has a mind which has such and such properties, but we do not know A has such and such properties, where A is the mind in question. In such a case, we know the properties of a thing without having acquaintance with the thing itself, and without consequently knowing any single proposition of which the thing itself is a constituent. Now, this tells us something indirectly about what Russell is going to say about names. You know things about Abraham, about Caesar, about Akhenaten. But you are not acquainted with these people. So we have to replace, when we say what the constituents of the propositions are that we know to be true, that are about these people, we have to replace the name with a definite description. That makes his account of definite descriptions much more significant than it would have been if we were going to characterize the role of names in some way divorced from definite descriptions. It makes On Denoting a paper that is also about how names function, so long as you can defend this descriptive theory of names. In any case, we could have skipped the Gray's elegy passage entirely, but he doesn't. Why does he introduce it? This is a structurally mysterious intrusion into the paper. There's no particular reason for bringing it up when he brings it up. In addition, the passage itself is deeply mysterious. Its content is very hard to figure out. Structurally, it's mysterious. Content-wise, it's also mysterious. So why does he bring it up? I think there's an obvious answer. It's because he's been reading Frege. He knows Frege has a problem. It's the problem of the concept horse. Because if you recall, Frege is committed to the viewpoint that the concept horse is not a concept. That's the problem indirectly that the Gray's elegy passage is about. And remember, what Frege said was, when we talk about the concept horse, Carey, when he first did it, used single quotes. When I use the phrase the concept horse, I use italics. And some such device looks like it signals that there's something different going on when we talk about the concept horse than when we talk about the city of Berlin. Now, it's not obvious that there's something weird going on, because instead of saying the concept horse, we could have said the concept of a horse, and then you didn't need single quotes or italics or any such thing. But in any case, what Russell is worried about here, I think what he's angling toward, is trying to get everybody to understand how hard it is to represent things properly. And it's a mystery how we're supposed to represent it. So that's where we're headed. The first word of caution is, I'm going to focus on what the issue is. What the actual argument is very hard to characterize. There is a paper, by the way, by Nathan Salmon on this that you can look up. He has a particular view. It's really complicated, so I'm not going to go over it, but there are attempts to say exactly what the argument here is. But in any case, here's what's obvious at the beginning. The passage is aimed at Frege's distinction between sense and reference. Note that Russell says, by way of summary, the relation of the meaning to the denotation involves certain rather curious difficulties, which seem in themselves sufficient to prove that the theory which leads to such difficulties must be wrong. So that's important because, remember, for Frege, if you take a definite description, the morning star, you posit both a reference and a sense. In Russell's hands, the morning star doesn't refer at all, so we don't need this distinction between sense and reference. So this is Russell's attempt to say, following Frege on how to treat definite descriptions is clearly a mistake. And we get hints along the way of what the issue is. What's wrong with this distinction between sense and reference? Russell says, mysteriously, there is no backward road from denotations to meanings. That's a trivial fallout, by the way, of Frege's account of sense and reference. Sense determines reference, but not the other way around. So you can't start with a reference and work your way back to the sense, because every object can be denoted by an infinite number of different denoting phrases. Fair enough. So what's the problem with the distinction? The problem is that Frege can only speak in generalities about what senses are. That's all he can say. He can't tell you straightforwardly exactly what they are. They compose an ontological third realm. They're what explains cognitive significance as well. But Russell wants to know about the particulars. Take a given sense. It's an individual, unique thing. What is that thing? Don't tell me what role it plays, but what is that thing? What is that sense? And when Frege talks about specific examples, he always characterizes the sense of a denoting phrase with a definite description. Another denoting phrase. So how could the second count as the sense of the first? E.g., we want to know what is the sense of the term Aristotle, and we're told that it might be the most famous student of Plato. Okay, so about the sentence, Aristotle was an Athenian, we say the most famous student of Plato is the sense of the name in question. But the most famous student of Plato is Aristotle, not the sense of Aristotle. All right, now this is a subtle point, so let me slow down. Look at this sentence. The most famous student, take the sentence, start with Aristotle was Athenian, and suppose you say the sense of the name in question is given by this definite description. Well, then it looks like what Frege is saying is this. The most famous student of Plato is the sense of the name Aristotle. But that can't be right because the most famous student of Plato is not a sense. It's Aristotle. Aristotle is an object. Aristotle, that man, is the most famous student of Plato. And so the most famous student of Plato can't be a sense at all because a sense is not an object. So the most famous student of Plato can't be the sense of the term Aristotle. So whatever this is doing, this can't be Frege's theory. It better not be on pain of total absurdity. So what is the sense of the name Aristotle? What can we do here? The point here is we can't use the definite description because then its semantic value is its referent. Perhaps we shall try to mention the description instead of using it. Notice that's what Carey did with the concept horse. He put the word horse in single quotes. But as I use single quotes, the semantic value of putting single quotes around a term or sentence or linguistic particle, the semantic value of that is the linguistic item itself. It refers to that linguistic item. So if you say the concept horse, that's goofy. Horse is a word, so the semantic value of horse in single quotes is the word horse, and the word horse is not a concept. So you can't do Carey's thing, but maybe you need to do something about mentioning rather than using this definite description. So the idea is this. Maybe you think I should have put single quotes around the most famous student of Plato and let that be the sense of the name in question. Then you'll say that the sense in question is not the most famous student of Plato, but rather the most famous student of Plato. But then what you cited denotes the linguistic expression inside the quotes, since single quotes are defined as a function from an expression to a name of that expression. So for Frege, that can't be right because a sense is not a name of anything, linguistic or non-linguistic. So on the usual account of use mention, you can't do that. So this long tortured argument by Russell is about this predicament. Frege identifies a role for senses but can't talk about them. It is the land of that which cannot be spoken in a quite literal metaphysical sense. And here's what Russell concludes about it. This is an inextricable tangle and seems to prove that the whole distinction of meaning and denotation has been wrongly conceived. That might be a premature conclusion, but if it's true that we really can't talk about these things at all, I can't tell you what they are. I ask you, what is the sense of the name Aristotle? And you can't tell me, there's something wrong with your theory. That is, in the words of Russell, an inextricable tangle. So schematically, Let's use this to try to think about what Russell is doing with the first line of Gray's elegy. That line is this: the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. And the definite description in question has that linguistic phrase as its denotation. The first line of Gray's elegy is that precise sentence. Now, Russell wants to talk about the definite description without having to write out the description every time, and he wants to use the letter C to do so. So let C be any denoting phrase, and we want to know about the meaning or sense of C in contrast to its reference or denotation. How do we do that? So we've got here the first line of Gray's elegy, and the phrase, the first line of Gray's elegy, has as its referent that sentence. But we're not worried right now about the reference of this definite description. We want to know about its sense, as Frege conceives of the distinction, or as anybody might conceive of the distinction between meaning and denotation, or between sense and reference. Remember, on sense and reference has not yet been translated into English. Russell is reading it in German, so he doesn't always use the standard language of sense and reference. There are translations, for example, that say the title of the article is on sense and denotation, for example. So when Russell uses other terms than sense and reference, it's because he's translating into English himself. So let C be a denoting phrase, like the first line of Gray's elegy, and we want to know about the meaning or sense of C. How do we do this? Well, let's talk about the meaning of C. But the meaning of C is just another definite description and refers us to an object, not a concept. And the sense or meaning on Frege's account of the distinction must be a concept. Okay, so we can't ask about the meaning of C. Maybe we should ask about the meaning of the phrase. Put it in single quotes and see what we get. What is this meaning? What is it? Is it the meaning of C? No, because that's an object, and the semantic value of C is C, not the meaning of C. That's the point I was making on the last page. Single quotes work to denote the linguistic item in question. And so they can't be giving you a sense, because a sense would have to be a concept. So the first two options, either using the expression or mentioning the expression, neither one work. So let's get creative. Let's just invent a notation. Put a star after C and say before and after. So what happens when we star C on both sides? It has as its semantic value the meaning or sense of C. Let's just invent terminology to do the work that we want, and now we have something whose semantic value is a sense. If that won't work, I think we should conclude that we have no idea how to talk about the particular sense of a denoting phrase. So, can it work? Suppose we say this, which Frege wants us to say. C enclosed in stars is a concept, not an object. Now, Frege has to insist that this is a mistake for the same reason that the concept horse is not a concept. So what is C? It's either got to be a concept or an object. Can we say it's an object? No, because then it can't be a sense. Can we say it's a concept? No, you can't say that either. What a mess. Even our invented notation isn't up to the task. It isn't up to the task of letting us talk about specific senses of specific denoting phrases. I think that's what Russell is up to, but I don't intend to vouch for this as the best interpretation of the specific passage in question. But when seeing Frege's response to the concept horse paradox, it's easy to sense that Something foul is in the air, and Russell is trying to pin Frege down on exactly which object that denoting phrases pick out. And he's trying some options that look like what might be said about the sense of these phrases that do have a reference, and showing that they don't work. For the argument to be compelling, we'd need an account of all the possible options and then a meticulous dismantling of each option. Russell doesn't do that, so perhaps the best we can do is to conclude that Russell has gone further than Frege on this issue and has issued a challenge to Frege that, if not met, undermines the distinction. So the best I can do here is to say, you've got three options. Use the phrase, mention it. Neither of those are going to work. Okay, let's just go as general as we possibly can and invent a notation that does precisely the work Frege needs it to do. And that doesn't work at all, because even with our stipulative invented notation, we cannot say what Frege says we need to say. So Frege's distinction between concept and object might be the thing that's at fault, or it might be the distinction between sense and reference. But no matter what you say here, something has to give. So one final thought here is, this is a structural inelegancy in a paper that you write. Just to jump in to a topic and talk about it at some length, leaving the reader wondering why in the world you're spending time on this. How does it connect with the general point that you're trying to make? It's interesting, it's intriguing, but structurally, what are you doing? The lesson is, you don't leave readers in the dark about what you're doing at particular parts of the paper or why you're talking about what you're talking about. People are impatient. If people stick with you through the end of it, it's an honor to you as a person. But you shouldn't be a writer who depends on people honoring you. You should be a writer who gives people a reason to pay attention to what you're writing about. Structurally, this is a bad idea. So even though it's a beautifully written paper, I love the introduction, it's easy to see what the parts are doing. There is a structural inelegancy here, and it's in the Gray's Elegy passage itself. In any case, we'll turn next time to this knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, because in this final note, we get a clue of how Russell plans to make progress in our understanding of the project of developing a semantics.